The military convoy rolled through the dusty streets as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Marcus Wellington sat in the back of the vehicle, his uniform still carrying the weight of 3 years spent in distant lands. His fingers traced the edge of a small photograph he kept in his breast pocket. The picture showed a smiling little girl with bright eyes and pigtails, frozen in time at age 5. She would be 8 now, he reminded himself. 8 years old, and he had missed so much. The base gates opened, and Marcus felt his heart quicken. After all the briefings and debriefings, after all the paperwork and medical evaluations, he was finally going home. His commanding officer had arranged for him to leave quietly, no fanfare, no media attention. That was how Marcus wanted it. He just wanted to see his daughter, to hold her, to make up for all the birthdays and bedtimes he had missed. The house looked exactly as he remembered it. The blue shutters his wife Sarah had insisted on painting, the small garden where tomatoes grew in wild abundance, the swing set in the backyard that he had built with his own hands before his deployment. Everything seemed frozen in time, preserved like a memory waiting to come alive again. Marcus paid the taxi driver and stood at the edge of the driveway, his duffel bag heavy on his shoulder. He had told Sarah he was coming, but he had kept the exact date vague. He wanted to surprise them, to walk through that door and see the pure, unfiltered joy on their faces. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob. 3 years of combat, of making split-second decisions that meant life or death, and now his hands shook at the simple act of entering his own home. The door swung open before he could turn the handle. Sarah stood there, her eyes wide with shock and then flooding with tears. She had aged, he noticed immediately, not in a bad way, but in the way that spoke of sleepless nights and carried burdens. Her hair had streaks of gray that weren't there before, and lines around her eyes told stories of worry and waiting. They embraced without words. What could words capture that 3 years of absence had created? They held each other in the doorway as the evening light painted long shadows across the floor. Sarah sobbed into his chest, her fingers clutching his uniform as if afraid he might disappear again. Marcus kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, that same lavender soap she had always used. When they finally pulled apart, Marcus looked past his wife into the house. Everything was neat and orderly, almost too orderly. The living room looked like a photograph from a magazine, not the lived-in chaos he remembered. Where were the toys scattered across the floor? Where were the drawings taped to the walls? Where was the life that a young child brought to a home? His daughter Emma was not in sight. Marcus felt a pang of disappointment but pushed it aside. Maybe she was at a friend's house, or maybe Sarah wanted a moment alone with him first. He stepped inside, setting his bag down by the door. The house smelled different too. It smelled of cleaning products and air freshener, covering up whatever real life existed beneath. Sarah wiped her tears and took his hand. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. She led him to the kitchen where she had apparently been preparing dinner. Pots sat on the stove. Vegetables lay half-chopped on the cutting board. She had been in the middle of ordinary life when he arrived, and now that life stood suspended, waiting for whatever came next. Marcus asked the question that burned in his chest. Where was Emma? Sarah's face changed. The joy that had been there moments ago flickered and dimmed. She looked away, her hand releasing his. She busied herself with the vegetables, her knife moving mechanically across the cutting board. She said Emma was upstairs in her room doing homework. Her voice was flat, rehearsed, as if she had practiced this answer many times in her head. Something was wrong. Marcus could feel it in his bones, in the way Sarah avoided his eyes, in the tension that suddenly filled the kitchen. He had learned to read danger in the battlefield, to sense when something was off even when everything appeared normal. That same instinct screamed at him now, in his own kitchen, in what should have been the safest place in the world. He moved toward the stairs, his military boots heavy on the hardwood floor. Sarah called after him, her voice rising with something that might have been panic. She told him to wait, to give her a moment to prepare Emma, to let her explain first. But Marcus was already climbing the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He had waited 3 years. He could not wait another moment. The hallway upstairs was dim. 3 doors stood closed, silent sentinels guarding their secrets. He knew which one was Emma's room. The door still had the wooden sign he had made for her 6th birthday, with her name painted in purple letters surrounded by butterflies. His hand reached for the doorknob and he noticed it was shaking again. He knocked softly and heard a small voice from inside. It was Emma's voice, but different. Older, yes, but also quieter, more cautious. She asked who it was, and Marcus felt his throat tighten. He announced himself, his voice cracking on the word Daddy. For a moment there was only silence. Then he heard movement, quick footsteps, and the door flew open. Emma stood before him, and time seemed to stop. She had grown so much. Her hair was longer now, falling past her shoulders in waves. She wore glasses, small round frames that made her look wise beyond her years. Her clothes were clean but worn, a faded t-shirt and jeans with patches on the knees. But it was her face that made Marcus freeze in place, that made the world tilt and spin around him. There were marks on her cheeks. Bruises, fading from purple to yellow-green, spreading across her delicate skin like storm clouds. One eye was slightly swollen, healing but unmistakable. Her lip had a small cut that was scabbed over. These were not the marks of a clumsy child who had fallen off a bike. These were the marks of something else entirely. Something that made Marcus's blood run cold and his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. Emma looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for an 8-year-old. Eyes that had seen things children should never see. Eyes that recognized pain and learned to hide from it. She smiled, but it was a careful smile, a practiced smile. She said Daddy in a whisper, as if afraid the word itself might bring trouble. Marcus dropped to his knees, bringing himself level with his daughter. His hands reached out but stopped just short of touching her face. He was afraid. Afraid that his touch might hurt her. Afraid that the questions burning in his mind might somehow make things worse. His voice, which had commanded soldiers and faced down enemies, now trembled as he asked her what happened. Who did this to her? Who dared to hurt his little girl? Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She had learned not to cry, Marcus realized with horror. She had learned to hold things inside, to be quiet, to not cause problems. She glanced past him to where Sarah now stood in the doorway, and in that glance Marcus saw everything. He saw fear. He saw secrets. He saw the careful dance of survival that his wife and daughter had been performing, while he was away fighting wars in distant lands. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. Marcus slowly rose to his feet, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more terrible than the last. He kept one hand gently on Emma's shoulder, feeling her small body tense beneath his touch. The protective instinct that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions now surged through him with overwhelming force. But this time the enemy was unknown, hidden in the shadows of his own home. Emma pulled away gently and retreated to her bed, sitting on the edge with her hands folded in her lap. The room around her was too neat, too organized for a child's bedroom. Books lined up perfectly on the shelf, toys stored away in labeled bins, the bed made with military precision. It looked like a room waiting for inspection, not a space where a child lived and played and dreamed. Marcus turned to his wife, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He asked again, his voice low and controlled despite the rage building inside him. Sarah stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. She leaned against it as if she needed the support to remain standing. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her hands twisted together nervously. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, searching for words that seemed impossible to find. Finally, she began to talk. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and Marcus had to strain to hear her. She told him about the man who lived next door, Mr. Peterson, an older man well respected in the neighborhood, a retired teacher who everyone thought was kind and gentle. He had offered to help with Emma after school when Sarah had to take on extra shifts at the hospital to make ends meet. At first it seemed like a blessing. He would help Emma with her homework, give her snacks, keep her entertained until Sarah got home. But then things changed. Emma started becoming quiet, withdrawn. She stopped playing with friends, stopped laughing at dinner, stopped being the bright, cheerful child she had always been. Sarah noticed bruises, and when she asked about them, Emma would make up stories about falling or bumping into things. Mr. Peterson always backed up these stories, explaining how clumsy children could be, how Emma had tripped over her own feet or run into a door. Sarah said she suspected something was wrong, but she had no proof. She had confronted Mr. Peterson once and he had been offended, hurt, claiming he was only trying to help a military family in need. He had threatened to report her to child services for making false accusations, for being an unfit mother who saw threats where there was only kindness. Sarah had backed down, afraid of losing Emma, afraid of the scandal, afraid that her suspicions might be wrong. Marcus listened, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Each word his wife spoke felt like a knife to his chest. He had been halfway around the world, fighting for freedom and justice while his own daughter suffered mere feet from her own home. The irony was bitter and burned like acid in his throat. He turned to Emma, his heart breaking at the sight of her small frame hunched on the bed. He sat down beside her, careful to move slowly to not frighten her. He told her that she was safe now, that he was home, that nobody would ever hurt her again. He asked her as gently as he could to tell him the truth about what had happened. No more stories about falling or being clumsy, just the truth. Emma looked at her mother, then back at her father. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks, running over the fading bruises. She told him about Mr. Peterson, about how nice he had been at first, how he gave her cookies and let her watch cartoons, but then he started getting angry over small things. If she made a mess or got a math problem wrong, he would grab her arm too hard or shake her. He told her she was stupid, that she was a burden, that her mother worked so hard because Emma was such a problem. The punishments got worse. He would make her stand in the corner for hours. He would take away her dinner if she cried, and then he started hitting her, slaps at first, then harder strikes that left marks. He told her that if she said anything, her mother would be in trouble. He said that military families who could not take care of their children got separated. He said Emma would be taken away and put in a home with strangers who would be even meaner. Emma spoke in a flat, emotionless voice, as if she was reciting facts about someone else's life. She had learned to detach, to protect herself the only way she knew how. Marcus felt tears streaming down his own face, something he had not allowed himself to do even in the worst moments of war. His little girl, his precious daughter, had been tortured in her own neighborhood while he had been unable to protect her. Sarah sobbed openly now, collapsing into a chair by Emma's desk. She said she had finally told Mr. Peterson that his help was no longer needed 2 weeks ago. She had rearranged her work schedule, taken on night shifts so she could be home when Emma got out of school. But the damage was done, and she had been terrified of what Marcus would think, of how he would react when he found out what had happened in his absence. Marcus stood up, his body moving on autopilot. He told Sarah to call the police to report everything Emma had just said. Sarah protested weakly, saying they had no proof, that it would be Emma's word against a respected member of the community. But Marcus was already heading for the door. He told his wife to make the call and to keep Emma inside, safe and away from the windows. Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his muscle. She begged him not to do anything rash, not to throw away his career and his freedom on a man like Peterson. But Marcus gently removed her hand. He told her in a calm, steady voice that he had spent 3 years following orders, fighting battles chosen by others, protecting people he had never met. Now he was going to protect his own daughter, and nobody was going to stop him. He walked down the stairs and out the front door. The evening had turned to dusk, and streetlights flickered on along the quiet suburban street. Everything looked so peaceful, so normal. Children's bikes lay abandoned on lawns. American flags hung from porches. Sprinklers watered perfectly manicured grass. It was the picture of safe, small-town America. But Marcus now knew that monsters did not only exist in war zones. They lived next door, hiding behind friendly smiles and respectable reputations. Mr. Peterson's house was dark except for a light in the living room. Marcus walked across his own lawn, his boots crushing the grass. He did not run. He did not rush. He moved with the steady, purposeful gait of a soldier on a mission. His mind was clear now, focused. He had a target, and he had a job to do. He reached the neighbor's door and knocked, 3 solid raps that echoed in the quiet evening. He could hear movement inside, footsteps approaching. The porch light came on and the door opened a crack. Mr. Peterson peered out, an older man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like someone's kindly grandfather, the type who would hand out candy on Halloween and wave to passing children. Recognition flickered across Peterson's face when he saw Marcus in his uniform. The man smiled, a practiced, pleasant expression. He said something about Marcus being home, about it being good to see him, about how he had been helping to look after little Emma while he was away. The words flowed smoothly, rehearsed lies delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. Marcus did not smile back. He asked Peterson to step outside. There was something in Marcus's voice, something cold and dangerous that made the older man's smile falter. Peterson asked what this was about, his tone turning cautious. Marcus repeated his request, slower this time, each word deliberate. "Step outside, now." Peterson shook his head, starting to close the door. He said it was late, that they could talk tomorrow, that there was no need for unpleasantness. But Marcus's boot was already in the doorway, preventing it from closing. He pushed the door open with one hand and stepped inside uninvited. Peterson stumbled backward, his face going from cautious to afraid in an instant. Marcus stood in Mr. Peterson's living room, his presence filling the space like a storm about to break. The house smelled of old coffee and mothballs, and the furniture looked like it belonged to another era. Photographs lined the mantel, showing Peterson with various groups of children, probably former students. Each smiling face in those pictures made Marcus feel sick, wondering how many other children this man had fooled. Peterson backed away toward the kitchen, his hands raised in a gesture that was meant to be calming. He asked Marcus what he thought he was doing, breaking into someone's home. He threatened to call the police, to press charges, to make sure Marcus faced consequences for this intrusion. But his voice shook, betraying the fear behind his words. He knew why Marcus was there. Guilty men always know. Marcus took a step forward, closing the distance. He told Peterson exactly what his daughter had revealed. Every detail, every bruise, every threat the man had made to keep a terrified child silent. Peterson's face went through a series of changes, from fear to indignation to calculation. He started to deny everything, his voice rising in mock outrage. He called Emma a liar, a troubled child who made up stories for attention. He said Sarah was an unfit mother who could not control her own daughter and was now trying to blame others for her failures. The words were gasoline on fire. Marcus's control, already stretched thin, began to snap. He had seen evil before, had faced it in combat. But there was something especially vile about a man who would hurt a child and then attack her character to save himself. His hands clenched into fists and every muscle in his body coiled tight, ready to unleash years of pent-up rage and frustration. But then he heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. Sarah had called the police as he had asked. Marcus forced himself to breathe, to think. He could not give Peterson any ammunition to use against him. If he touched this man, if he let his anger control him, Peterson might walk free while Marcus went to jail. That could not happen. Justice had to be served, but it had to be the right kind of justice. Marcus stepped back, creating space between them. He told Peterson that the police were coming, that Emma's testimony would be documented, that doctors would examine her injuries. He said that even if Peterson managed to avoid criminal charges, everyone in this neighborhood would know what kind of man he really was. No more positions of trust, no more access to children, no more hiding behind a respectable facade. Peterson's face crumbled, the mask of the kindly old man shattered, revealing something ugly underneath. He shouted that Marcus had no proof, that it was just a child's word against his. He said he had lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, that people respected him, that no one would believe a story from a troubled military family. His words grew more desperate as the sirens grew louder, stopping right outside. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows. Car doors slammed. Heavy footsteps approached the house. Marcus walked to the door and opened it, greeting the two officers who stood on the porch with their hands near their weapons. He identified himself calmly, explained that he was the one who had entered the house, and provided a brief summary of why. He said his daughter was next door with his wife, ready to give a statement about the abuse she had suffered at Peterson's hands. The officers looked at each other, then at Marcus, then past him at Peterson, who stood frozen in his living room. One of the officers, a woman with sergeant stripes on her uniform, asked Marcus to step outside. He complied immediately, moving onto the porch and then the front lawn. He did not resist, did not argue. He knew how this had to go. He was technically in the wrong for entering Peterson's home, but the officers needed to hear the full story before making any decisions. More cars arrived. A detective, a social services worker, and a supervisor from the police department all descended on the quiet street. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They stood on their porches and lawns, whispering to each other, phones out recording the scene. Marcus stood calmly in the center of it all, answering questions when asked. directing officers to his wife and daughter when they needed statements. Sarah came out of their house with Emma, both of them accompanied by a female officer who had been sent to take their statements. Emma clutched her mother's hand, her eyes wide at all the police cars and people. When she saw her father standing on Peterson's lawn, her expression changed from fear to something else. Relief. Trust. She knew her father had done what he promised. He had protected her. The detective, a middle-aged man with tired eyes who had probably seen too much in his career, spent a long time talking to Emma. He was gentle, patient, using language she could understand. He asked her to describe what happened when it started, how often it occurred, where Peterson had hit her. Emma answered each question, her voice growing stronger as she realized that these people believed her, that she was not going to get in trouble for telling the truth. Sarah provided her own testimony about the changes she had noticed in Emma, the bruises she had questioned, the suspicions she had harbored but been afraid to act on. The detective did not judge her for waiting so long. He understood the complicated dynamics of abuse, how abusers manipulated situations and victims alike, how hard it was to speak up against someone the community respected. The detective also spoke with Marcus, asking about his confrontation with Peterson. Marcus told the truth. He said he had been angry, that he had wanted to hurt the man who had harmed his daughter, but that he had restrained himself. He acknowledged that entering Peterson's home had been wrong from a legal standpoint, but he did not apologize for confronting the man. The detective nodded, making notes, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, other officers were inside Peterson's house, searching with a warrant that had been quickly obtained. They photographed everything, collected potential evidence, looked for anything that might corroborate Emma's story. Peterson sat on his couch, silent now, a lawyer having been called. His moment of panic had passed, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who understood the legal system and how to navigate it. The neighborhood watch had gathered in clusters, their shock evident. Mrs. Chen from 3 doors down kept saying she could not believe it, that Peterson had watched her grandchildren once. Mr. Rodriguez, who lived directly across the street, said he had always thought Peterson was a bit odd, too interested in being around children, but he had never said anything because, well, who was he to judge? The comments and revelations kept coming, painting a picture that made Marcus's blood boil. How many people had noticed something but stayed silent? Hours passed. The night grew late. Emma was taken to the hospital for a thorough examination by a doctor who specialized in child abuse cases. Sarah went with her, along with the social services worker who would document everything for the inevitable court case. Marcus stayed behind, giving additional statements, answering more questions, cooperating fully with the investigation. The detective finally told Marcus that he would not be arrested for entering Peterson's home, given the circumstances, but that the district attorney's office might still want to discuss the matter. Marcus accepted this without complaint. He had known there might be consequences for his actions and he would face them. What mattered was that Emma was now safe, that her abuser was being held accountable, that the truth was finally out in the open. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Peterson was led out of his house in handcuffs. Neighbors who had stayed up through the night watched in silence as he was placed in the back of a police car. He kept his head down, refusing to look at anyone. The respected retired teacher, the helpful neighbor, the kindly old man was gone. In his place was just another criminal, caught and exposed. Marcus stood in his front yard, exhausted but unable to rest. He watched the police cars pull away, carrying Peterson to jail where he would await charges and trial. The street slowly returned to quiet, though it would never return to normal. Something had been broken here, an illusion of safety shattered. Parents would look at their neighbors differently now. Children would be warned more carefully. Trust had become a luxury no one could afford. Sarah called from the hospital. Emma was okay physically. The bruises would heal, the cuts would close, but the emotional damage would take longer to address. They had been referred to a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. There would be therapy sessions, probably for years. Emma would need help processing what had happened, learning to trust again, understanding that what Peterson did was not her fault. Marcus listened to his wife's voice over the phone, hearing the exhaustion and pain in every word. He told her he would come to the hospital right away, that they would face this together, that their family would heal no matter how long it took. Sarah cried again, but this time there was relief mixed with the sorrow. The secret she had been carrying, the burden of knowing her daughter was being hurt and feeling powerless to stop it, was finally shared. Marcus drove to the hospital as the sun fully rose over the city. The streets were empty at this early hour, and he made good time through the quiet morning. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind would not rest. Images of Emma's bruised face kept flashing through his thoughts, along with all the moments he had missed while deployed. Birthdays, first days of school, lost teeth, bad dreams. He had missed all of it, and in his absence his daughter had suffered. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty. Marcus found a spot near the entrance and sat in the car for a moment, gathering himself. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel, hands that had held weapons, that had fought enemies, that had saved lives and probably taken them too. But these same hands had not been there to protect his own child when she needed him most. The guilt was crushing. Inside, a nurse directed him to the pediatric wing. He walked through hallways that smelled of antiseptic and floor polish, passing rooms where other families dealt with their own crises. A child cried somewhere nearby. A doctor was paged over the intercom. Life and death and healing all mixed together in this place, just another day at the hospital. He found Sarah sitting in a waiting area, clutching a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her eyes were closed, her head leaning back against the wall. She looked so tired, so worn down by everything she had endured alone. Marcus sat down beside her and she opened her eyes, managing a weak smile. She leaned into him and they sat in silence, drawing strength from each other's presence. Emma was still being examined, Sarah explained. The doctors wanted to be thorough, to document everything properly for legal purposes. A psychologist had already done a preliminary assessment, determining that Emma was stable enough to go home but would need regular counseling. Child Protective Services had also interviewed her, standard procedure in abuse cases. Everyone was kind, Sarah said, but the process itself was exhausting for Emma, who had to tell her story over and over to different people. Marcus asked if Emma had said anything more about what happened. Sarah shook her head. Once Emma had told the truth, it seemed she had said everything she needed to say. The rest was just repeating details for official reports. Sarah also mentioned that the detective had called with an update. They had found evidence in Peterson's house, photographs of other children from the neighborhood. Nothing overtly criminal, but enough to suggest a pattern of behavior that raised serious concerns. The news made Marcus feel cold. How long had Peterson been operating? How many children had he targeted before Emma? The detective was reaching out to other families, asking questions, looking for other potential victims. It was possible that this case was bigger than anyone initially realized, that Peterson's crimes stretched back years. A doctor emerged from one of the examination rooms, a clipboard in hand. She introduced herself as Dr. Martinez and shook hands with both Marcus and Sarah. She explained that Emma's physical injuries were healing well. The bruises would fade completely in another week or two. There were no broken bones, no permanent physical damage. But she emphasized the word physical, making it clear that the psychological wounds were another matter entirely. Dr. Martinez recommended immediate counseling and provided referrals to specialists who worked with child abuse victims. She also suggested family therapy, noting that everyone in the household would need help processing what had happened. Trauma did not affect just the victim, she explained. It rippled outward, touching everyone close to the situation. Marcus and Sarah would have their own healing to do. They were finally allowed to see Emma. She was sitting up in a hospital bed, dressed in a gown that was too big for her small frame. She looked tiny and vulnerable against the white sheets. When she saw Marcus, she reached out her arms and he rushed to her, wrapping her in a gentle embrace. She buried her face in his chest and he felt her body shake with silent sobs. He held her for a long time, rocking slightly, whispering that everything would be okay. Sarah joined them, and the three of them formed a tight circle of family, broken but not destroyed. They stayed like that until Emma's crying subsided and she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked up at Marcus and said something that broke his heart all over again. She said she was sorry for causing so much trouble. Marcus cupped her face gently in his hands, careful to avoid the bruises. He told her that none of this was her fault. Not one single bit. She had nothing to apologize for. The only person responsible was the man who hurt her. He told her that she was brave for telling the truth, that she had done nothing wrong, that he was proud of her. Emma nodded, wanting to believe him, but Marcus could see the doubt in her eyes. Abuse left invisible scars, teaching victims to blame themselves. Undoing that damage would take time. They were discharged from the hospital around mid-morning. The drive home was quiet, Emma sitting in the back seat staring out the window. Sarah sat in front holding Marcus's hand tightly. When they pulled into their driveway, Marcus noticed that Peterson's house was empty now, police tape across the door. Several neighbors were outside, clearly waiting for them to return. Mrs. Chen approached immediately, tears in her eyes, apologizing for not seeing what was happening, for not protecting Emma. Marcus accepted her apology gracefully, though inside he felt anger at all these people who had been oblivious or willfully blind. But he also understood that predators like Peterson were skilled at hiding their true nature, at presenting a facade that fooled even vigilant observers. Blame needed to be directed at the guilty party, not at those who had been deceived. Inside their home, Emma went straight to her room. She wanted to be alone, to process everything in her own space. Sarah started making phone calls, setting up appointments with the counselors Dr. Martinez had recommended, handling the practical details that came with a crisis. Marcus stood in the living room feeling lost and unsure of what to do next. His commanding officer called, having heard about the situation through military channels. He offered support, asked if Marcus needed anything, mentioned that there were resources available for military families dealing with trauma. Marcus thanked him but said they were managing. He did not want to lean too heavily on his military connections. This was a family matter and they would handle it as a family. Days began to blur together. Emma started seeing a therapist named Dr. Lisa Chen, a woman who specialized in childhood trauma. The sessions were difficult at first. Emma was reluctant to talk, afraid of saying the wrong thing, worried about getting people in trouble. But Dr. Chen was patient and skilled, using play therapy and art to help Emma express feelings she could not put into words. Marcus accompanied Emma to some sessions, sitting in the waiting room and sometimes being called in to participate. He learned about the stages of trauma recovery, about how children processed abuse differently than adults, about the importance of creating a safe and predictable environment. He learned that healing was not linear, that there would be good days and bad days, that setbacks were normal and expected. Sarah also started therapy, working through her own guilt about not protecting Emma sooner. She was struggling with the question that haunted many parents in similar situations. How had she not known? How had she missed the signs? The therapist helped her understand that abusers were manipulative, that they deliberately created situations where detection was difficult, that she had done the best she could with the information she had at the time. Marcus found himself battling his own demons. The anger he felt toward Peterson had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger as he learned more about the extent of the abuse. He had violent thoughts, fantasies of confronting Peterson again and not showing restraint this time. He knew these thoughts were normal but unhealthy, and he eventually agreed to see a counselor himself. His therapist was a former military man who understood the unique challenges faced by veterans returning home. They talked about the disconnect between battlefield morality and civilian life, about the difficulty of feeling powerless after years of being trained to take action, about the guilt of not being present when family needed protection. The sessions helped Marcus understand that he could not control everything, that sometimes bad things happened despite best efforts, that healing required accepting imperfection. The legal process moved forward slowly. Peterson was formally charged with multiple counts of child abuse, assault, and other related crimes. More families came forward, children who had been in Peterson's care over the years. Some reported physical abuse, others emotional manipulation and verbal assault. The picture that emerged was of a man who had been targeting vulnerable children for at least a decade, carefully selecting victims who were unlikely to speak up. Marcus attended every court hearing, sitting in the gallery with Sarah, showing Peterson that they would not be intimidated or silenced. Emma did not have to testify at the preliminary hearings, her statements and medical records being sufficient for the prosecution. But they all knew that if the case went to trial, she might have to face Peterson in court and recount her experiences. It was a possibility that filled Marcus with dread. The neighborhood slowly returned to a semblance of normality, though everything had changed. Parents were more cautious, more involved, more vigilant. 3 months passed, each day bringing small victories and occasional setbacks in the healing process. Emma's bruises had faded completely, leaving no physical trace of what she had endured. But the internal wounds remained, visible in the way she startled at sudden noises in her reluctance to be alone, in the nightmares that still woke her crying in the middle of the night. Marcus had taken leave from the military to focus on his family. His commanding officer had been understanding, recognizing that Marcus needed time to help his daughter heal. The military had its own support systems, counselors trained to help families deal with trauma, resources that Marcus and Sarah gratefully accepted. Money was tight with only Sarah's hospital salary coming in, but they managed. Material things mattered less now. Emma's therapy sessions were showing progress. She was beginning to smile more naturally, to engage with activities she had once loved. Dr. Chen introduced coping strategies that helped Emma manage her anxiety, breathing exercises and grounding techniques she could use when memories threatened to overwhelm her. Marcus and Sarah learned these techniques too, becoming part of Emma's support system. One afternoon, Dr. Chen called Marcus and Sarah in for a family session. Emma sat between her parents on the comfortable couch in the therapist's office, a room designed to feel safe and welcoming. Dr. Chen explained that Emma had reached a point where she wanted to talk about what happened with her parents present, to share feelings she had been working through in individual sessions. Emma spoke haltingly at first, her voice small but growing stronger as she continued. She talked about the fear she had lived with, how every day going to Peterson's house had felt like walking into danger. She talked about the confusion of having an adult hurt her while claiming to care about her. She talked about the shame she had felt, the belief that somehow she deserved the punishment, that she was the problem Peterson always said she was. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he listened. Sarah was openly sobbing, reaching for tissues from the box Dr. Chen kept readily available. Emma looked at her parents and said something remarkable. She said that telling the truth had been scary, but it was also the moment when she started to feel free. She thanked her father for coming home, for believing her, for making Peterson go away. Dr. Chen guided the conversation expertly, helping them all express feelings that had been bottled up. Marcus apologized to Emma for not being there when she needed him. Emma, with the clarity that sometimes comes from children, told him that he was fighting for other people, that she understood he was doing important work. She said that what mattered was that he came home and helped her when he found out. Sarah also apologized, her voice breaking as she explained to Emma how sorry she was for not recognizing the signs sooner, for not protecting her better. Emma reached out and took her mother's hand. She told Sarah that Peterson was very good at lying, that he fooled everyone, that it was not Sarah's fault. The forgiveness from a child who had every right to be angry was humbling. The session ended with Dr. Chen praising the family's progress. She said that they were doing all the right things, supporting each other, being honest about their feelings, working through trauma in healthy ways. There would still be difficult days ahead, she warned, but they had the tools and the love needed to get through them. Life began to establish new rhythms. Marcus took over most of Emma's care, driving her to school, helping with homework, making dinner. Sarah continued working at the hospital, though she had reduced her hours to spend more time with family. Money was tighter than ever, but they made sacrifices willingly. They canceled cable, stopped eating out, cut back on unnecessary expenses. What they gained in family time was worth far more than anything they gave up. Emma's school had been informed of the situation, and her teachers were supportive and understanding. They gave her extra time on assignments when she needed it, provided a quiet space where she could go if feeling overwhelmed, and kept an eye out for signs that she might be struggling. Her grades, which had dropped during the months of abuse, slowly began to improve. Making friends was harder. Emma had withdrawn from social activities during the abuse, and now she found it difficult to reconnect. She had missed birthday parties and playdates, and other children had moved on, forming friendship groups that Emma was no longer part of. Marcus and Sarah worked with the school counselor to help Emma rebuild her social connections, setting up supervised playdates with understanding families. The legal case moved toward trial. Peterson's lawyer had tried multiple tactics to get the charges dismissed or reduced, but the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple victims had come forward, their stories forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Medical records, photographs, Testimony from parents and teachers all painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. The prosecutor offered Marcus and Sarah the chance to meet before trial to discuss what to expect. They sat in a conference room at the district attorney's office, listening as the prosecutor explained the process. Emma would likely need to testify, to tell her story in front of a jury and with Peterson present in the courtroom. It would be difficult, possibly traumatic, but her testimony was crucial to securing a conviction. Marcus asked if there was any other way, any possibility of sparing Emma the ordeal of facing Peterson in court. The prosecutor was sympathetic but honest. Peterson had rejected all plea bargain offers. He was gambling that a jury might not believe children's testimony, that a good lawyer could create reasonable doubt. The only way to ensure justice was to go to trial, and that meant Emma and the other victims would need to be strong enough to tell their stories. Dr. Chen worked with Emma to prepare for the possibility of testifying. They practiced in the therapist's office with Dr. Chen playing the role of a lawyer asking difficult questions. Emma learned that it was okay to say she did not remember something, okay to ask for a question to be repeated, okay to take breaks if she felt overwhelmed. The practice sessions were hard, but they helped Emma feel more prepared. Marcus also prepared himself for the trial. He knew he would have to sit in that courtroom and hear details of what his daughter had suffered. He would have to remain calm, not react, not give Peterson's lawyer any ammunition to use. His therapist worked with him on coping strategies, ways to manage the rage that still simmered just beneath the surface. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in November. The courthouse was an imposing building with marble floors and high ceilings, designed to inspire respect for the law. Marcus, Sarah, and Emma walked up the steps together, surrounded by other families whose children had been victimized by Peterson. They drew strength from each other, a united front against the man who had hurt them all. Peterson sat at the defense table, looking smaller than Marcus remembered. Prison had not been kind to him. He was thinner, older-looking, with the defeated posture of a man who knew his life was over regardless of the trial's outcome. His lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, whispered constantly in Peterson's ear, no doubt coaching him on how to appear sympathetic to the jury. The prosecutor's opening statement was powerful and direct. She laid out the evidence methodically, explaining how Peterson had used his position as a trusted neighbor and former teacher to gain access to vulnerable children. She described a pattern of behavior spanning more than a decade, escalating from emotional abuse to physical violence. She promised the jury that they would hear from victims, see medical evidence, and have no doubt by the end of the trial that Peterson was guilty. The defense lawyer's opening was predictable. He portrayed Peterson as a lonely old man who had only wanted to help neighborhood families. He suggested that the children were lying, influenced by attention-seeking parents or confused by leading questions from investigators. He asked the jury to consider that perhaps these were accidents, misunderstandings, a case of good intentions gone wrong. Marcus clenched his fists as he listened, rage building at the lawyer's words. Sarah put a hand on his arm, reminding him silently to stay calm. Emma sat between them, surprisingly composed. She had steeled herself for this, knowing that Peterson's side would try to make her look like a liar. Dr. Chen had prepared her well. The prosecution began presenting its case. Medical experts testified about Emma's injuries, explaining that the pattern of bruising was consistent with intentional strikes, not accidents. School counselors described changes in Emma's behavior that aligned with the timeline of abuse. Child psychologists explained how abusers manipulated victims into silence and why children often delayed reporting. Each piece of testimony built a stronger case. But Marcus knew the most powerful evidence would come from the victims themselves. The prosecution was saving their testimony for maximum impact, building context first so the jury would understand exactly what they were hearing when the children took the stand. On the third day of trial, Emma's turn came. Marcus felt his heart racing as his daughter was called to testify. Sarah gripped his hand so tightly it hurt. Emma stood up, smoothed down her dress, and walked to the witness stand with her head held high. She looked so small in that big chair. The microphone adjusted down to reach her height, but she did not look afraid. The prosecutor approached gently, asking Emma to sta. The cross-examination was brutal. Peterson's lawyer tried every tactic to discredit Emma, suggesting she was confused, that she had fallen and made up stories to cover for being clumsy, that she was seeking attention. He asked the same questions multiple times in different ways, trying to trip her up to find inconsistencies in her testimony. But Emma held firm. She answered each question honestly, sometimes saying she did not remember exact details but never wavering on the core truth of what Peterson had done to her. Marcus watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She should never have had to be this strong, this brave. She should have been playing with dolls and worrying about homework, not sitting in a witness box defending her truth against a lawyer paid to make her look like a liar. But Emma was remarkable, showing a courage that even some adults lacked. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Emma's testimony concluded. The judge asked if she was okay, and Emma nodded. As she stepped down from the witness stand, she walked directly to her parents. Marcus swept her up in his arms, not caring about courtroom decorum, just needing to hold his daughter. The judge smiled slightly and called for a recess, understanding that this family needed a moment. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Emma finally let the tears come. She had held them back during testimony, refusing to show weakness in front of Peterson, but now she sobbed into Marcus's shoulder. Sarah wrapped her arms around both of them, and they stood in that embrace while other families and lawyers moved around them. Dr. Chen, who had been observing from the gallery, joined them and praised Emma for her bravery. Other victims testified over the following days, each telling their own version of the same story. Peterson had targeted them, gained their trust or their parents' trust, and then systematically abused them. Some of the children were even younger than Emma, barely old enough to articulate what had happened. Others were teenagers now, testifying about abuse that had occurred years earlier but still haunted them. The cumulative weight of all those testimonies was devastating. Jury members were seen wiping tears. Even the judge, who had probably presided over hundreds of difficult cases, seemed affected. Peterson sat at the defense table, his expression blank, showing no remorse or recognition of the pain he had caused. The prosecution rested its case after a week of testimony and evidence. The defense called only a few witnesses, character witnesses who testified that Peterson had been a good teacher, a helpful neighbor, someone who cared about children. But their testimony rang hollow against the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution. How could anyone claim Peterson was good when so many children had been hurt? Peterson himself did not testify, probably on the advice of his lawyer, who knew that cross-examination would destroy any remaining credibility. Instead, the defense rested quickly and moved straight to closing arguments. The lawyer made one last desperate attempt to create doubt, suggesting that perhaps Peterson had been too strict as a caretaker, that modern sensibilities had criminalized old-fashioned discipline, that there was no real evidence of intent to harm. The prosecutor's closing argument demolished this defense. She methodically reviewed the evidence, reminding the jury of each child's testimony, each medical report, each piece of documentation, showing Peterson's deliberate pattern of abuse. She asked the jury to consider not just the physical evidence but the emotional impact, the way these children's lives had been altered by Peterson's actions. She asked them to deliver justice not just for Emma and the other victims, but for every child who deserved to feel safe in their own neighborhood. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Marcus and Sarah waited in the courthouse cafeteria, unable to eat, unable to focus on anything except the passage of time. Emma was with Sarah's sister, spared the agony of waiting for a verdict. Other families from the case joined them, all of them bound together by shared trauma and the hope for justice. When the bailiff finally announced that the jury had reached a verdict, they all filed back into the courtroom. Marcus felt his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. Sarah's hand was ice cold in his. They took their seats in the gallery and waited as the judge entered and the jury filed back to their box. The foreman stood when asked if they had reached a verdict. He said they had. The judge instructed the defendant to rise. Peterson stood, his lawyer beside him, and for the first time Marcus saw fear in Peterson's eyes. The foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of child abuse, guilty of assault, guilty of making terroristic threats, guilty of every charge the prosecution had brought. The courtroom erupted in muffled sobs and sighs of relief. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order. She thanked the jury for their service in what she acknowledged was a difficult case. She remanded Peterson to custody pending sentencing, which would occur in 30 days. As officers led Peterson away in handcuffs, he looked back at the gallery, at all the families he had destroyed. His expression was still blank, still showing no remorse. Outside the courthouse, the prosecutor spoke to the gathered families. She thanked them for their courage in coming forward, for trusting the system even when that trust had been hard to maintain. She promised that at sentencing, she would argue for the maximum penalty, for consecutive rather than concurrent sentences, for consequences that reflected the severity and scope of Peterson's crimes. Marcus and Sarah drove to pick up Emma. They told her about the verdict, watching as relief and happiness transformed her face. She asked if Peterson would go to jail for a long time. Marcus promised her that yes, Peterson would be locked away where he could never hurt another child. Emma smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. The sentencing hearing was less dramatic, but no less important. Multiple families presented victim impact statements, describing how Peterson's abuse had affected their children and their entire family units. Sarah spoke eloquently about watching her daughter transform from a happy child into a withdrawn, frightened victim. Marcus spoke about the guilt he felt for not being there to protect his daughter, and about the long road to recovery they were still traveling. Emma had chosen not to speak at sentencing, and no one pushed her. She had already been brave enough in testifying. She had done her part, and now it was up to the judge to finish what the jury had started. The judge listened to every statement, taking notes, her expression grave. When it came time for sentencing, the judge spoke at length about the responsibility society had to protect its most vulnerable members. She talked about the trust that had been placed in Peterson as a teacher and neighbor, and how he had violated that trust in the most horrific ways imaginable. She sentenced him to 30 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. At his age, it was effectively a life sentence. Peterson was led away, and this time he did not look back. His life as he had known it was over. He would grow old in prison, remembered only as a monster who hurt children. There would be no legacy of good deeds, no fond memories from former students, nothing but the shame of what he had done. The months following the sentencing brought continued healing. Emma's nightmares became less frequent. She started playing with other children again, joining a soccer team, going to birthday parties. The joy that had been stolen from her was slowly returning, planted in a different soil now, watered by the love and support of her family. Marcus decided not to return to active military service. He had given enough years to fighting distant wars. Now he wanted to be present for his family, to make up for lost time, to ensure that Emma always knew her father was there for her. He found work as a security consultant, using his military experience in ways that kept him home. Sarah reduced her nursing hours to part-time, choosing to prioritize family over career advancement. The financial sacrifice was worth it to have more time with Emma, to be present during the continuing therapy sessions, to create new positive memories that would eventually outnumber the bad ones. They sold the house where Emma had suffered. Too many painful memories haunted those rooms, that neighborhood. They moved to a new town, a fresh start where nobody knew their story. Emma enrolled in a new school where she could be just another kid, not the girl from the trial that had been all over the news. In the new house, Marcus built Emma a new swing set, bigger than the old one. He hung it in the backyard where she could see it from her bedroom window. On sunny afternoons, he would push her on the swings, watching her hair fly back as she laughed. Those moments were precious, proof that childhood joy could survive even the darkest trauma. Emma continued therapy, though less frequently now. Dr. Chen had helped them find a new therapist in their new town, ensuring continuity of care. Emma still had bad days, moments when something would trigger a memory or a fear. But increasingly, she had good days too. Days when she forgot to be afraid, when she just lived like any other 8-year-old girl. One evening, almost a year after Peterson's sentencing, Emma came to Marcus while he was reading on the couch. She climbed up beside him, something she had been doing more often lately, seeking the physical closeness that reassured her of safety. She asked him a question that had clearly been on her mind. She asked if he was